Hi, my name is Steve, and I made a game about sailing. So, what brought all this about? Back when I came up with the idea for this project, I had recently played a game for the Nintendo Switch called Windbound. It's an action survival roguelike, where you can build a boat and sail it to traverse a world of islands spread across a distant sea. And I thought, wow, this is fun, learning and mastering how to control a sailboat to such a fine degree. Why don't more games do that? And I admit, the reason I was so invested was because I had some experience with sailing, and this was the first game I'd played to actually try and emulate that in a realistic way. But more on that later. So I made a sailing game. The physics model was loosely based in realism, much like Windbound, so it observed and adhered to concepts like wind direction, points of sail, and sail trim. I gave players one of two ways to control the boat under this model, at random, and gave them the other later to A/B test between them. One gave the player full access to the basic aspects needed to control a sailboat, the height and angle of the sail, and a direct control over the rudder. The other simply toggled whether or not the sail was active, and automatically adjusted the sail and rudder to the optimal angles to steer the boat where the player wanted it to go, much like another popular sailing game. After playing with each control scheme, players were given a variant of a widely used 10-question Likert scale HCI survey known as the System Usability Scale, aka SUS. The results of that survey are shown here. As you can see, there's a slight preference toward the simple control scheme, but it's only marginally significant, statistically speaking. I did ask a few demographic questions, asking participants how often they played games, and whether or not they had any prior sailing experience, hoping that one of those subpopulations would be more strongly in favor of one scheme over the others, but while some results are marginally significant, none of them really stood out either, and all of them favored the simple controls. But what's really interesting is the qualitative feedback. None of the feedback was directed at the concept of the more complex control scheme, but rather the poor quality of the camera controls and the specific button mappings. So make sure to polish those in your future games. And while it was mixed, people did actually enjoy the comprehensive control scheme. About a third of the respondents expressed their preference for the complex controls, and that despite the control scheme being more difficult, players generally felt that it would get easier over time. Ultimately, the study proved inconclusive, in part due to the extremely poor sample size. But while there isn't a strong argument for having these more nuanced control systems in games, there isn't a strong argument against doing so either, except for time and budget constraints. So if you're able, don't be afraid to implement a mechanic just because you think it'll be too complicated or difficult to control. If it's good, players will still try to master it. Thank you.